これ人間の機関なんだ。宣伝したろ、ちょっと。本物の世界権力見せてやれ。見せてくれ。あんたらのそこへ見せてやれ。アメリカの政府ですね。カウンセラーのフォーリンのレーションズ並みの権力がある。世界中見せてやれ。
And states are there to promote the greatest public good. I have experiences in many parts of the world where bold and clever public policy has actually ramped up industrial competitiveness and growth of
お前らのわがままにつけられるかボケ。そんなん言ったらもう断るわボケ。見たこの国。あうわボケ。ジョー・バイデン大統領が会うてこういう。
few decades, bold policy giving a clear vision as well as renewable energy targets and leaving the markets to set up the prices was and drove the lowest solar price for renewable energy in the world in 2017. You can count that example and many other examples where bold public policy has actually catalyzed an industrial revolution for the good. We are in a moment of a planetary emergency. We are both in a nature crisis as well as in a climate crisis. And if the states don't raise up their bar and put strong policies in place, it's going to be difficult that we get where we want to get. Businesses are waiting, progressive businesses are waiting, but if we don't have a common playing ground, it's going to be difficult for us to ramp up the mass of the businesses and non-state actors that are ready to act. Well, on the one hand, the European Union is very well equipped. We have been doing quite a lot of trade agreements in the world the last years. In the European Union, the Commission negotiates on behalf of 28 member countries, which gives us a big strength. We just concluded agreements with Canada, with Japan, with Singapore, with Mexico, and others are in negotiations. But of course, with the changing climate, with countries not respecting WTO rules, countries going increasingly bilateral, there is a challenge there. So we are looking at how to reform our policies, of course, to be still able to do trade agreements, to strengthen the WTO and reform it with other like-minded countries, but also to protect ourselves against countries who are not playing according to the rules, and to make sure that the European, the level playing field is respected. We have changed our trade defense mechanisms. We have implemented a coordination mechanism for investment screening, and we are looking at how to sharpen our tools, and this will be a key issue for the new Commission coming in as well.
When will it all end? Brexit. I think the truthful answer is that we will know with the general election on the 12th of December the time to complete the first chapter. Either Boris Johnson will win, in which case Britain will exit the European Union on or about the end of January 2020, or alternatively, if there is a majority for the opposition parties combined, then there will be a second referendum in the middle of next year. But the trouble is, neither of those outcomes is going to settle things definitively, because a second referendum, it might well lead to a narrow vote to remain in the EU, but that would not end the division in the United Kingdom. And of course, if Mr Johnson wins his majority, then we've got to negotiate the new relationship on trade, on security, on foreign policy cooperation between the United Kingdom, which will remain a big European power, a major player in defence and security and economic terms, but it's going to be next door to the European Union. Those 27 countries are going to be my country's most important trading partner, our closest geographical democratic neighbours for as far ahead as I can possibly see. So working is going to take, I fear, a year, more than a year, I would estimate. And I think there's a real responsibility both on UK political leaders but also on EU political leaders to get this right. European democracy is under massive strain from Russian aggression, from a dramatic economic change that is adding to public mistrust in the way in which we do business. So getting the geopolitics right, having a constructive future relationship between the UK and our neighbours in the EU 27 is important for the whole of the European democratic community.
I don't think anyone wins in trade conflicts, and even the word war is, I think, a bit overstated because wars end up being zero sum. One wins, one loses, and in the case of trade, it should be a win-win operation. So I think the analogy is mistaken, and by closing off your own markets, you increase costs to your own people. In the United States, about 50% of imports are for commodities or intermediate goods, so if you raise those costs, you raise costs for manufacturers and consumers in the United States, or same would be the case in Europe. And in the case of the US and China, I think that we're in a very dangerous situation. I think that there are many reasons and frustrations with China. Some of them are justifiable about forced technology transfer, intellectual property rights, reciprocity. There's also concerns about Chinese security and other policies. But I think you can find allies within China on a number of the trade issues, and you actually want to try to keep pushing both sides to a rules-based system. So I think that the path that we're on with China has led to more of confrontation. And in fact, what you're probably going to need to see is some combination of competition, cooperation, and confrontation, or at least drawing lines on some issues. So I think with a country as big as China, you need a more multifaceted policy.
Gamification and game-based learning indeed is the future of lifelong learning. I believe that because as we train the new generations of in the workforce, we know that we need to create materials that are a lot more engaging, that are a lot more useful, and that are going to have an impact in the way that they learn and in the way that they acquire the new skills that they need in order to remain competitive in the marketplace. What a better way to do that than through video games? As children, we learn through playing, and we believe that through gamification and through game-based learning, we can make learning fun again, not only for children, which we know is the best way to learn, but also from adults. If they play these video games, they will become more engaged, as I said earlier. They will also acquire that knowledge much more deeply, and they will be able to apply that knowledge in their daily jobs. And finally, by doing the video games through the simulators, they will be able to have experiential learning to get the feedback on what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, and learn from that.
Very clearly, I think the world is moving towards a secular economy. It's a necessity. When you look at water scarcity, when you look at waste pollution, everybody is now aware of that. If we want to make a conciliation between the planet for our children and economic development, we need to move towards a secular economy, and by education, by innovation, by a different way of doing business, both for citizens and also by companies, we will make this move, which will help us collectively to have a planet great again. Thank you.
21st century is going to be shaped by the twin forces of globalization and digitalization, both of which are going to be terrific for consumers. Digitalization means that people will be able to consume entertainment wherever and whenever they want. And globalization means that that opportunity will be given to people around the globe. While there's some concern that large companies are going to dominate the future of the entertainment landscape, I actually have a different view, because I feel that digitalization is very empowering to creators. And when you think about a phenomenon like YouTube and user-generated consumption, these are powerful, powerful forces. Similarly, digitalization has allowed the falling of distribution barriers. So not only is production much easier, but the ability to distribute it to people is much easier. And we're really living in a golden age of entertainment with many more choices than we have. And that also means a greater democratization of ideas. And again, all of this is happening on a global scale, which is really enabled by digital technology.
I would say that the characteristics of a Nordic education system is that, first of all, we have a very inclusive system based on public funding where there should be a room for all. I think students are taught to think independently, a lot of critical thinking, and also quite a lot of creativity baked into our education. I would especially commend the Finnish system where they put their best teachers for the youngest students, and they use a lot of resources in preschool and also first to third grade to ensure that the children are best possibly equipped for future learning. And I believe that that's the best investment you can make, is to invest in the kids when they're really young, so you lay the foundation for their future learning.
Okay, well, what is actually the biggest threat from cybersecurity for Europe? Of course, we can concentrate and focus on the security side, but I would take it a bit on the other side, that if we really go to focus too much on the security side, then it really would slow down our development. I think it is the biggest threat is that we lose competitiveness. And that is for me the whole part, because if we want to be leaders in innovation, we should also know innovation, it has two aspects. First, I think you must have a great idea, but you must be the first. So that means speed. And we must make sure that I think we have an ability to be innovative and to be the first and to have speed. So for me, that is the biggest threat of cybersecurity, to get a slowdown.
So are we suffering from eco-anxiety? The simple answer is yes, possibly too much. Eco-anxiety is definitely triggered by the fact that we are facing a very urgent matter with climate, but at the same time, it's also because we're facing something that is very complex. It's very difficult to understand the impact of climate change, and it's very difficult to understand the solutions to reach a low-carbon economy. So in the world of investment where I am, what I see is those who are actually acting every day to invest in climate change investments and low-carbon economy investments are actually less susceptible to eco-anxiety because they can see the result and the impact of what they do. But really what is needed to decrease this anxiety is more examples of impactful investment, change of behavior in society that would actually bring people to less anxiety.
had been in a situation where U.S. and West European support for Ukraine was very well coordinated, and we were maintaining a consistent pressure on Russia to begin to negotiate seriously about ending its occupation of eastern Ukraine. Unfortunately, I think now the impeachment dynamics in the U.S. have really knocked U.S. policy off the table. We don't have the people, we don't have the engagement, we don't have the same focus, and as a result, I think that takes a lot of the pressure off of Russia to negotiate. I'm hopeful that as we have a Normandy format summit, possibly on December 9th, it may take a little bit longer, that can retain some of that negotiating dynamic, but I'm afraid that right now the situation is much more difficult for Ukraine than it should be.
What is the role of civil society in modern Russia? I would say it's a very important issue. Why? Because in Russia, political competition is limited, there are no real opposition parties, so the society stands up to the autocratic regime through organizing itself, through building trust, through providing public goods that a corrupt and inefficient state cannot provide. And it's not just protesting corruption, it's not just about asking for democracy and rule of law. Civil society today is working on helping the poor, helping the disadvantaged, fighting domestic violence, promoting gender equality, defending minorities. So this is actually where the European future for Russia is. And luckily, with the new communication technology, with internet, it's easier to organize itself, it's easier to inform itself, and it's easier to promote change, creating new Russia that eventually will become part of Greater Europe.
At a time when 1,000 NATO troops are stationed at the border between Estonia and Russia to deter possible Russian aggression, when President Macron is speaking about what he calls cercle concentrique, when citizens in Moldova and Georgia are questioning whether Europe and the US will come to rescue if there is a security guarantee, and when sanctions against Russia and counter embargoes have become kind of the very essence of the idea of a European security policy, well, what can we expect from Russia? We know that Putin is actually more popular than most of his competitors, but will Medvedev be a different leader than Putin? In short, can we expect a different kind of trajectory from Russia in the coming years when the bureaucratic elite inside Russia is focusing more on digitalization than what some might call modernization? As always, the views on Russia are diverging.
Democracy can survive the current period of disruption, but it's going to have to change. The volatility and the risks that we are witnessing across much of the Western world are anchored in some very deep changes that have been swirling beneath our democracies, that have been coming for many years and still have a long way to run. They relate to strong feelings of distrust in the political system, widespread fears over the perceived destruction of ways of life, national identity, big worries over deprivation, the way in which the economic settlement is playing out, and weakening bonds between the mainstream parties and ordinary voters. Those four currents have been with us for a very long time, before the Great Recession, before the arrival of Facebook and Twitter and big tech, but they are now producing very substantive political effects, and they will
continue to produce substantive political effects. So liberal democracy has to change. It has to make its political systems more representative. It has to ensure that people feel that their nations and communities are secure and have strong and robust external borders. And it also, over the long term, needs to devise an economic settlement that ensures that everybody feels that they are relatively getting the gains and the benefits that other groups in society are getting as well. Very big challenges, no clear answer as to now. The ball is very much in liberal democracy's court.
So bringing Trilateral to Slovenia means also bringing Slovenia to Trilateral. And as you know, David Rockefeller Fellows had a pre-program. It is our pleasure that we connected them at the MCHM breakfast with Slovenian Business Society. They were talking about the global issues and how connected the world is, with some local representatives and even some members of Trilateral. It is also our pleasure that the former Prime Minister, who is the current Minister for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Miro Cerar, had the time to meet with them and discuss where the Europe is today and where the Europe is going. And of course, we have finished our program with amazing lunch with Professor Diana Zohar.
Liberal democracy will not survive in an unchanged form. It has not been changing enough to accommodate the vast, speedy development of the internet and of the communication technologies. And it has been changing too much, even the rather static nature of men.
Crystal ball? We're in the middle of a psychodrama in Britain, political and social, and it's very hard to predict how it will end up. Parliamentary drama, a drama inside the Conservative Party, and a drama in the country at large. I do not think it is certain that the British will leave the European Union.
Protectionism is never a good solution for trade, because in the long run it will endanger the competitiveness of everyone. The European car industry, whether you talk about OEMs or whether you talk about such suppliers, is very competitive, is export-oriented, is very successful on world markets, but most of the companies are not only delivering cars to other parts of the world, they are also producing cars in those parts of the world, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in China, whether in Southeast Asia, where they have a lot of success. That means in the long run, free trade is always the better solution for economy and for the countries which want to safeguard jobs and prosperity.
A quantum leader is a new paradigm leader who realizes that the world is holistic, all things, all people, all problems are interconnected, There are no others. There is no separation. I am you, you are me. Thus, a quantum leader would say the problem of inequality very differently, or the problem of identity very differently, because we are not separate, atomistic, isolated individuals, and our problems are not separate, isolated, and atomistic. A quantum leader is ethical, is moral, has compassion. A quantum leader is self-aware. A quantum leader celebrates diversity. A quantum leader asks fundamental questions, always questioning him or herself, questioning assumptions, questioning the way things have been done, questioning the norm. Someone who lives at the edge of chaos, who shakes things up, who thrives on uncertainty, who thrives on chaos. A quantum leader is filled with compassion, and a quantum leader feels called to lead, called to serve. There's a sense of purpose, a sense of higher meaning in his or her leadership. A quantum leader is a servant leader. He exists to serve others and to serve the world, indeed to serve the universe.
Well, there's no simple answer to that, to the issue of asymmetric attacks on democracies. The point being that you can disrupt elections in democratic elections in a democratic country. It's rather difficult to do it with an authoritarian regime, since they really don't have genuine elections. And so what are you going to do when you are attacked? I think we need a broad range of responses, beginning with looking at our electoral systems to ensure that they are proportional, so you don't have the kind of issues you had in the U.S. presidential elections, where because of the electoral college system, some states had far more weight. I think we need to look at the kind of electoral systems we have, and make sure that we get a broad representation rather than a simple binary decision of a first past the post election system. We need to think about our asymmetric advantages. We have rule of law. That's pretty important. It's interesting that the authoritarian regimes all place their money abroad in places where there is rule of law. Why? Because in an authoritarian regime, you can just lose everything all at once. Someone takes your money. Whereas if it's in the West, or rather in a rule of law country, then that's unlikely. Well, maybe we can make it more difficult to keep your money here. Or we can be much more, we definitely should be much more transparent about ownership. After all, much of the money laundering that we've seen from the authoritarian states that are attacking us goes through anonymous shell companies. These are, again, issues that need to be taken up by government authorities in order ultimately to defend democracy.
Silicon Valley provides a unique ecosystem, basically in some sense a network of having a very strong university that's very applied, that is all about working with the real world, doing basic research, and then trying to put that basic research into the society, into the good. An important thing, I think, is also that it's a social network of sharing. Is that basically in California there is no non-competes, so people move around freely, and this means that the flow of innovation is much faster. The other important thing is the size, the critical mass, again, of very large amounts of talent, so that companies can be scaled up very quickly. For example, in my own experience, I started working with Pinterest when there was less than 200 of us. 3 years later, there is a few thousand of us. And the company culture and everything wasn't lost, and the new people got hired. And then I think the last thing is that universities, as well as kind of companies, focus less on protecting their IP and really trying to move as fast as possible. Because if we think about innovation is about moving fast, and it's not so much about building walls and figuring out how to do the next step very carefully. It's really about running and iterating fast. And if we run and iterate fast, then the success will be there, and kind of little details don't matter that much. And I think this is important from the viewpoint of university, letting the research be put in the public domain and really benefit the environments in which the university's professors operate, as well as in terms of companies sharing the information and flow of people with each other. So there is, for example, in Silicon Valley, a lot of different seminars, people from one company visiting the other company, sharing quite openly actually what they are doing, writing academic papers, again talking about their latest solutions, so that we are all up to date, and the entire system can kind of help each other in terms of making the most innovation and the most progress in the short amount of time. Because I think the question is not can we innovate, but the question is, or can we invent something, but the question about innovation is, can we be the first ones to do something? So it's as much about the speed as it is about the substance.
We had a really good discussion today. Reviving the European dream is what we really want. The next year will be the election for the European Union, for the Parliament of the European Union, and it is really important that there will be a strong mandate. One of the challenges we are facing at the moment is still the migration crisis, and also the priority of the Austrian presidency is security and the fight against illegal migration. So we had a good discussion today on all these topics, and of course there are different opinions on this, but in general we are always on the same line. We want to have a solution for the European Union and for Europe. Safe external borders and legal migration, because Europe will need it in the end. But people still have in front of their eyes the migration flood in 2015, and therefore it is really important to have a good solution, and a solution which will be implemented in all the countries of the European Union, to have a resilient European asylum system.
Migration is currently one of the key issues of European citizens, and my view is that it will remain so, especially because migration is here to stay, and it will probably increase in numbers and complexity because of the political consequences of wars, the terrorism, but also because of the climate change. I think, in my view, migration is needed in Europe. I think it's something that we can benefit from, and I think that we need to change the narrative on this. First and foremost, us as politicians. Actually, the demographic of Europe says that migration is something that we will need in the future in order to maintain and grow our economic development, the quality of life. And I think that we should also go back to the European shared values and human values that are, I think, the foundation stone of Europe, so that together we can change, as I said, the narrative and help these people, but also help ourselves grow and develop further. Thank you.
Turkey belongs to the European family. There is no way that Turkey can distance itself from the realities of Europe. Today, of course, at the Trilateral Commission, we are going to discuss 3 scenarios. confrontation, cooperation, and membership of Turkey to the EU. In these three scenarios, of course, there are different outcomes. But I would say that confrontation between Turkey and the EU is a complete lose-lose scenario. And if it is only cooperation instead of membership of Turkey to the EU, this will be some sort of limited cooperation, and it will be a scenario in which both Turkey and the EU will not be able to enjoy the full potential. In economics, we say, this is not cost effective at all. But when it comes to EU membership, I would say that this will mean full use of potential of Turkey and the EU together. This means a stronger, stable, respected, fully democratic Turkey, but this also means in the world scene a global actor of EU, peace-bringing EU, welfare-creating EU, employment-creating EU. So I would say that in this case, membership case, the outcome would be win, win, win. So win for Turkey, win for the EU, but also win for beyond.
To define what you mean by Europe and the European Union having its own army. I do not think Europe needs its own army for what I would qualify as the classical Article 5 NATO scenario, in other words, in a conflict with Russia. But Europe should definitely, the European Union should definitely develop the possibility to project hard power without the United States of America. I can imagine a scenario in Northern Africa where you have a combination of terrorism, climate change, migration. It's an ungoverned part of Africa, largely, where Boko Haram meets Al-Qaeda, where Al-Qaeda meets Daesh. In other words, it's not impossible. Look at the French and what they did and are doing in Mali, that you would need to intervene militarily, and then the European Union would be on its own. Second scenario, virtual but not impossible, when in the Balkans the demons of the past would raise again. And we should not repeat the situation like we had in the 90s of the previous century, where finally Bill Clinton and the United States of America had to come in to stabilize the situation. I could think about the need for border protection, external border protection, with military means. You're a bit on the border here between the military and the military police, the gendarmerie in French. In other words, if that is meant by President Macron and Chancellor Merkel with a European army, I can follow them. What we should not forget, by the way, is when you talk about European military intervention, that's why I like the qualification European army not much, is that there will always be national parliaments who will decide if those soldiers will be sent into harm's way. So they will not, I hope, talk about a European command and a European parliament which decides this goes to the heart of the sovereignty of nations, and those nations will want to decide themselves. I see the way out as presented by President Macron of France, the European Intervention Initiative, where you can build coalitions of the willing outside the EU institutions. You can build coalitions of the willing, which you will always need for such kind of military operations. Advantage of a coalition of the willing is that after Brexit, you can keep Great Britain on board, because they will not anymore be a member of the European Union. At the same time, PESCO, the Permanent Structures Cooperation, should of course continue, important project, but rather bureaucratic and rather cumbersome. So that would be my answer to the question, does Europe need its own army?
Developments in these last few years are showing us that
can say that the EU is strongest towards candidate countries. When a country wishes to accede to the European Union or to the Eurozone, it tends to follow the suggestions and the prescriptions of the EU as much as possible to make progress. And that is the moment when the magnet effect of European integration is really great, and by the way has induced countries in the past, if we think of the Balkans for example, also to establishing better relations among each other in order to qualify for membership of the EU. Then the problem is that sometimes relative vis-à-vis member states, the EU is not so strong in terms of leading them to respect its own rules as pro-Europeans would like to see. And we can even see in recent years, for example, a greater leniency in terms of allowing infringements of the Stability and Growth Pact. But then the most recent experience is how difficult it is for a country to leave the European Union if it so decides. And the monumental example of Brexit shows us that vis-à-vis a member state which wants to leave the European Union still has quite a remarkable power. We have seen in the case of the negotiations on Brexit, the EU displaying really unexpected unity among the 27, also thanks to the skills and determination of Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier, and we are seeing how difficult it is for the UK to get its act together. And this, in my view, should be also kept in mind by countries here and there where governments play with the idea of perhaps leaving one day the EU or the Eurozone. They better keep in mind that it is tremendously difficult. If it is proving to be so difficult for a country of the standing, the experience, the administration of the quality of the UK, I don't want to imagine other specific examples of countries where the politicians sometimes say, let's get rid of the EU. Not only I have no idea where those countries would end up, but also they will suffer very, very much in the process.
Does the European Union need its own army? Well, here's what I think. The vision of a European army is actually a useful vision because it is good to know what the long-term goal might be. But is the European army something we can put together right now? No. And why not? First and foremost, because the European Union does not even have the mechanism to come up with clear political decisions and to speak with one voice in crisis. So the first step which we in the European Union need to take together is to change our decision-making process. We need to go from consensus to qualified majority voting. We need to learn that all of us, whether we are 27 or 28, will only be listened to, will only be respected, and can only be a military actor in the world if we speak with one voice. And that requires majority voting. So that's step number one.
And the next steps are capabilities, and we will need to work on that also. And then we can think of the long-term vision of a European army.
When one thinks about the 2015 migration crisis, it is true that we have gone a long way as a European continent. And we've gone a long way because in 2015 we were hit with a massive crisis. Hundreds of thousands of migrants coming to Europe's shores. And that is not the case anymore. It is true that the overall numbers have decreased. But is that enough? Is it enough to just look at the overall numbers? Or should one also focus on what's happening within each EU country? And I say that because there are certain EU countries, such as Greece, such as Italy, such as Spain, which have taken a far greater hit than others when it comes to the migration crisis. And yes, the numbers are overall down, but problems do persist in countries like the ones I just mentioned. So the question one needs to ask is, has Europe done enough in order to alleviate the effects of the crisis throughout the entire EU 28? Has Europe done enough in order to share burdens? And I say that particularly because when one looks at the figures regarding relocation of refugees across Europe, then one will realize that not enough has been done in that direction. And so one is led to the question, what kind of Europe do we want? Do we want a Europe where we all share the benefits of Europe, or do we also want a Europe where the countries also share burdens?
What can we do in order for democracy to survive? So I would like that to be the main theme for our conversation. And I can simply leave it with that and ask you, so what does it take and what can we do?
Well, I should tell you first what I've been talking to people about. So, my wife and I have been on a 100-city tour since January. And I've spoken to about 250,000 people over the course of that, in Australia and New Zealand and throughout the US and Canada, some in Europe, mostly in the UK and the Scandinavian countries. I'm coming back here in March and April to go through the South and the East. When I speak to audiences, I always watch people one by one, because I never speak to the crowd. And I always listen to the entire audience, because what I'm trying to manage when I'm speaking is to put everybody in the same place so that there's dead silence. Because if there's dead silence, that means that everybody's concentrating on the same thing, and that everybody has come to a collective agreement that that thing is of substantive importance. And the most reliable means of silencing an audience of 2,500 people, regardless of where that is around the world, is to make a strong case for the relationship between suffering, meaning, and responsibility. And the case for suffering, I think, is quite obvious, because one of the things that I point out to my listeners is that life has a tragic element. We all are perfectly aware of that. And that we're subject to that as fragile and finite creatures. And that tragic element is amplified by the human proclivity for malevolence at a psychological level and at a social level. And that's the reality that we find ourselves confronted with eternally, in some sense. And that the proper antidote to that is not the pursuit of happiness,
And it's not even the existence of the individual rights that are part of the substructure of democratic society, but the willingness to accept voluntary responsibility for those preconditions and then working to rectify them. And the corollary of that is that it's almost inevitably the case that people find the meaning that sustains themselves through suffering and that enables them to be motivated sufficiently to constrain their own malevolence is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. And it's surprising that a message that has that much weight, let's say, and that little frivolity, because there's no frivolity, let's say, in that, silences people. Can democracy survive? Well, first of all, if you ask the typical person in a democratic society whether they would like it to survive, the resounding answer to that is going to be yes. The people who are working to undermine it are a tiny radical fringe on both ends of the political distribution, let's say, with a disproportionate amount of exposure and power. And the people in the middle are lost in some sense without a uniting narrative. And a huge part of the narrative that has united democratic countries since their foundation isn't the doctrine of rights. And it's not the doctrine of individual happiness. It's the doctrine that the individual is the sovereign foundation of the polity and maybe of the cosmos itself, which is something that I happen to believe, given the important role that consciousness plays in existence itself, and that it's useful and necessary to call to people to remind them of their responsibility as sovereign individuals. And so I'm encouraging people to develop a vision for their life, to adopt full responsibility for themselves in a manner, and not in a manner that pertains specifically to their narrow self-interest or happiness, but to something that's much broader in scope, to think that each person should take on the voluntary requirement to take care of themselves, but also their future selves, because each of us is a collective that stretches across time, and whatever you do impulsively in the present merely means that you sacrifice yourself in the future, and that's not a sustainable or intelligent solution. And you want to take on responsibility for yourself and your future selves in a way that's of maximal benefit to your family, if you can manage that. And then perhaps if there's something left over in terms of your capability, then you can do both of those things in a way that maximally supports and serves the community. And for many young people, that's something they've never heard, is that we've made a very bad case, all of us, I would say, that each of these people, each person, has that sovereign responsibility, and that if they adopt it, that actually constitutes something of singular importance. And that's an old religious idea, in some sense, that each person has a soul, let's say, that is somehow a center of reality itself, and that needs to be manifested in life itself, and that if it isn't manifested, then something of tremendous value is not brought forward, and worse, and this is the end of the case, let's say, and worse, to the degree that that's not brought forward, then something hellish moves in to take its place. And people understand this sort of thing a lot more clearly than you might think if you explain it to them as if they might understand. And then it gives them a series of purposeness that straightens out their life. And so my sense is the way that you revivify democracy is by remembering its fundamental insistence that the individual is at the cornerstone of the state, and that everything you can possibly do to fortify the individual, simultaneously, the individual is the eyes of the state, is the collapse into a kind of nihilism that's completely counterproductive. And so, well, so that's been my experience.
Well, now it is the end of the Ljubljana meeting, which was a great meeting. We have had excellent discussions, we have learned a lot, and we have thought a lot. And now I hope to see you in Paris next June. It will be a plenary session, and all of us, we shall be there. So please do come to Paris.
So this morning we had a session on the future of mobility, and we actually discussed what does it mean for the auto industry and what does it mean for the cities. If you look at the auto industry, there has never been as much change as there is today. On the technology side, with connectivity, electrification, autonomous driving, on the social domain, with sharing, more urbanization and new ways of working, and also on the regulation side, where it's about emission control and standards, and also on regulation for managing congestions in the city. So we actually covered that. We also talked about what does it actually mean for the cities? How will actually the traffic evolve if you have more AVs and individual mobility through AVs? What would be levers to actually work on getting a mitigation on traffic, and basically how to deal with heightened traffic from autonomous vehicles? What would be the impact of actually sharing more cars, of basically having smaller or basically bus-based autonomous vehicles? And actually, how would you deal with occupancy-based pricing? How would you actually work as a city to make the whole modal mix work, and in the end get to a better transportation for the whole city?
We had a conversation yesterday in the dinner with Nigel Higgins on, I would say, the crisis, the causes of the great financial crisis, and whether or not we are in a situation where we could expect new major difficulty, taking into account what we have done since the crisis that erupted in 2007-2008. I have to say that the questions which were asked by Nigel were very, very stimulating. I could embark on explaining that, in my opinion, it was very much a multi-dimensional causes that we had to cope with. We had certainly the over-indebtedness that had accumulated from year 2000 up to 2007-2008, approximately 25% of the global GDP as an additional public and private debt outstanding. That was a major cause. Another cause was the new emerging properties of the new global finance system with the impact of technology, new IT technologies, and globalization. And amongst the properties, the emerging properties that I could witness myself when I was president of the ECB in 07, 08, 09, 10, 11, was that the contagion was taking place extraordinarily rapidly. You know, in the old times, you would expect that a major shock here would be transmitted to the rest of the world as a matter of months or even quarters. In the new world in which we are, it's a matter of half days. And we could experience that in 08 dramatically, obviously, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And we have other causes that are also important because, as I said, it's multidimensional. But I stress that the two causes that I mentioned just now, namely
these emerging properties and the rapidity of contagion on the one hand, and the debt overburdening the global economy are still there. And we, particularly as regards the level of the debt outstanding, public and private, as a proportion of global GDP, we continue to have a piling up of debt more or less at the same pace after the crisis as before the crisis. And this is worrying, and it calls for extreme vigilance, obviously, and hard work to complete all what we have done and should do, again, to prevent the new crisis, and if we have new shocks that are very difficult to predict, to prove resilience in the new environment which we will have to accept, because we have a recession in the US and in Europe, or because we have geostrategic events that would be very, very shocking at the global level, or for any other reason. That's what we discussed.
Strategic mission for Europe has to care on the globalized world. That means to stabilize our neighborship, to stabilize Africa together with others, but Africa is one of the major challenges for Europe as well. And of course, to make our European values as attractive as possible in the global competition, which order is the better one.
Some people wonder why best practices in government haven't spread faster amongst the democracies. When you see, for example, that New Zealand has solved the problem of public finance, why doesn't everybody copy it? Why doesn't everybody copy the way that the South Koreans teach their kids mathematics? Why doesn't everybody copy the way the Swiss decentralize their politics? And I think part of the answer is that we don't really spend nearly enough time looking at what is best practice. I live in the United States, though I grew up in the United Kingdom. One hardly ever hears a reference to other countries' systems in the US debate on healthcare, except when somebody is making a completely caricatured analysis of the way, say, Canada does things. So I think part of what we need to do is stress the need to look at best practice so that politicians and voters become more aware that there are solutions to most of the public policy problems. We just haven't tried them in many countries. On the other hand, I think there's one other side to this that one shouldn't forget. Sometimes you'll meet people who'll tell you, well, the Scandinavians have worked everything out, and Sweden or Finland or Denmark has come up with the perfect solution to policy problems. That's often an argument people make on the left in the United States. But I don't think the solutions that the Swedes came up with in recent decades necessarily would work in a country as large and as diverse as the United States. So let's look at best practice, let's understand which systems deliver the best results, but let's not pretend that one size is going to fit all. Part of the reason for the success of Western civilization, which is where democracy began, was the diversity of systems and the competition between them.
I recently read that information is now the world's most consequential and contested geopolitical resource. I think that's right. Global internet penetration has revolutionized the information domain, and information operations, which aren't new, are dramatically expanding in scale and scope. This is a new challenge for media organizations, which are already facing a business model crisis and declining trust. Meanwhile, AI advances confer a strategic advantage to those with access to lots of data. This has implications for privacy, but also for the information advantage that democracies have traditionally enjoyed.
Well, does European diplomacy exist? It's not an easy question, and the answer is yes and no. Yes, in an institutional sense, that is, Mrs. Mogherini today exists, she travels, she can deliver some messages for Europe, but I would say certainly not on the most fundamental issues of foreign policy, because members of the European Union are, many of them, very old nation states. They have their own foreign policy, defense, security apparatus, and so forth and so on. And I cannot imagine the French diplomacy just to be second to the European diplomacy, and the same with the UK, as long as the UK is in the EU, or the German diplomacy, and I can continue the list. So, in my judgment, the best merit of the EU diplomacy is first to perhaps reduce as much as possible the differences between the various diplomacies of the member states. And this, as such, is not so bad. And also, I think the EU diplomacy can deal with some relatively secondary issues, such as, for instance, I'm thinking of the Timor case in Indonesia, that is issues which are not at the forefront of national diplomacies, but which nevertheless can have some importance. So, to conclude, I would say that the real European diplomacy will exist only the day when the Europeans have a clear understanding of what they want to achieve, what is the identity of the European Union still to be built, because diplomacy, like defense, has to do with the protecting the identity of a political unit. And I think we have not yet reached the stage when we are able to answer this question: what is our identity, and what is it exactly that we want to protect?
はい、というわけでした。コリンゲール期間見ないのわからないね。はい、これがビルダーバーグ。あ、こういうことでした。確かにこういうの見せる。ね。これがビルダーバーグ会議ね。面白くねえねボケ。おい、誰や笑い物にしたの。誰や、出てこいや。
China's rise will change the international configuration from the unipolar to bipolar, and also possibly make the world order and different from before. But it doesn't mean that the China's rise is the only factor to change the current international order. And actually, the Trump administration's policy is more challenging than China's rise to the current international order. Because China's policy tries to maintain the order, the reason is very obvious. China benefits from the present order, and meanwhile, the Trump administration believes and China current order than the United States.
ありがとうございますね。コリンゲール期間の皆さん。
Based on the ideology of
こちらがビルダーバーグ会議。
anti-establishmentism. So from my
こちらが
side, if we talking about what the
やっぱ
ideology
本場はこれでしょ。
challenging the current international order globalized order. It's anti-establishmentism in US
そういうことでした。
in the Europe.
もう自民党、お前ら暗殺行くぞ。10月1日以降。自民党本部前に抗議運動するのアメリカ大使館もやるぞ。そういうことでした。やります。以上。